Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream, our live discussion every Tuesday to talk about all things related to the tech agnostic world of digital transformation. This is meant to be an independent and objective live discussion. And today we are going to talk about digital transformation and ERP software predictions for 2026. So we're going to get into the big trends and predictions that we have in mind for the coming year as we're helping our clients through their digital strategies and helping them navigate their overall digital transformations. These are the trends that we're keeping an eye on. And we're going to walk through some of the top 10 lists that we're about to release. It's actually going to be released on my YouTube channel next week, I believe it is. Will be my official top 10 predictions for 2026. That video is in production or in editing now. It'll be out shortly. But in the meantime, I thought I'd unpack some of those trends and predictions here in more detail with you all, give you a preview of that top 10 list, and also see what you think some of the big trends and predictions are, or see which ones you disagree with, what you might add to the list, what you might add to the conversation. So I'd love to hear from you here today, wherever you're joining from. Please drop in the chat any questions you have along the way. We're going to dive into this here with you, the audience, and love to hear your feedback as we get going into the top 10 trends and predictions. I'm not going to do this countdown style per se. I'm going to cherry pick a few of them and unpack them in a bit more detail. But I'll give you a preview of what some of those main ones are, and stick around to the end because I'll wait until last to give you my number one prediction for 2026. And it's a big one. I think it's one that will stir up some conversation, maybe even some controversy. I don't know. We'll see. So stick around to the end of the conversation because we'll get to my number one prediction for 2026. But in the meantime, I am checking the stream here, the chat from all the platforms we're streaming to. Thank you for joining from YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, X, or TikTok, depending on where you're joining from today. Thanks for being here. So any questions you have, drop them in the chat. And in fact, I'd love to hear from you right now. What city and country are you joining from? That gives me some context of what you might be seeing that's different, that might be somewhat geographic dependent. Or we might see some commonalities across these different regions that we're all from. So drop in the chat if you don't mind what city and country you're joining from today. I'd love to hear from you. And thanks again for being here. So top 10 technology and ERP predictions for 2026. This is what we're gonna dive into here today. And I'm just gonna jump right in and start the conversation with a few of them. And again, I'm not gonna go in any particular type of order here other than saving the best for last, which would be the number one for next year. So I'm gonna cover a couple of them that I think are maybe a little more innocuous just to get started, and then I'll get into some of the meatier ones as we get going here today. But the first thing I want to talk about is something that we're seeing in the tech space right now, and I think we'll continue to see this in 2026, is that organizational change management will continue to become more of a boardroom issue. So we are finally seeing organizational change management as a discipline, as a field, as a function, and as a strategy. We're finally seeing that get the credit and the due it deserves in the digital transformation space. I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, it was like pulling teeth trying to get people to understand the importance of change management, the importance of focusing on the human aspect of adoption and enablement of technology and actually using technology to deliver business value. And I think companies are finally recognizing, I suppose it's better late than never. It used to drive me crazy that it was so hard to convince companies to focus on change management. But I think at least at a high level or conceptually, executives and boardroom types of people finally are understanding that change management is critical to success. Now, the one thing that we haven't seen is we haven't seen organizations follow that understanding with the proper budgeting and focus in a project. So in other words, on the surface, yes, people are saying change management is important. That will be a key to success, if not the key to success. But there's not a lot of substance behind that in terms of understanding what that means or how to execute on that. And in other words, what we're also seeing is that companies are still investing an overwhelming amount of their budget and time and putting the risk into more of the technology stream. So we're still seeing companies with what I would consider way too much of a heavy focus on technology and still not nearly enough investment in change management. But people are at least paying change management lip service, which I suppose is a start. It doesn't solve the problem entirely, but just creating that awareness, I suppose, is a first step in improving this aspect of what I consider to be a pretty big problem in the digital transformation space. When you have an entire industry that was built around technology and supporting and promoting technology, it's very difficult to cut through that noise and say, hey, time out. Let's focus a little less on technology and all the cool, sexy stuff like AI and predictive analytics and Internet of Things, all these trends that we've been seeing over the last few years. It's hard to cut through that noise and see past the hype and the tech trends and look to the heart of what's really going to make any of those projects successful. And that is and always has been change management. Nothing's changed here. This isn't anything new. This is, I mean, my top 10 predictions back in 2010 were saying the same thing, which is change management will continue to be a critical success factor in the coming year. And, you know, I think, like I said, the good news is people are starting to recognize it. But I don't see, in mass at least, organizations following that up with the right focus, the right prioritization of activities and budget and attention, all that stuff. I still don't see it from most companies, at least not intuitively. So that's a big challenge I think we've got to overcome here as an industry. So I want to say hello to some of the audience here. Thank you for chiming in and where you're joining from today. Darian on LinkedIn says good morning. Thank you for being here, Darian. Scott on LinkedIn joining from Austin, Texas. Thank you for being here. We've got Sandra joining on LinkedIn from Chicago. And we also have Fahad, who is also on LinkedIn joining from Chicago. So thank you for being here today. And I already got a question from the audience that we'll just dive right into. And that is from Paul on LinkedIn. Paul says, how do I lead a transformation when the team is working on the technology is outside my jurisdiction? That's a great question. I guess I would have to ask, if you don't mind, I'll ask you a follow-up. If the technology is in a separate work stream, I guess the question would be, first of all, which work stream are you in? I mean, that would help me frame the answer a little bit better if I understood what your role is or what your function is within the project. But also, I guess I would ask, do both, whatever work stream you're in, the technology work stream and any other work streams of the project, is that all reporting up to the same program management structure? So I guess that would be a two-part question for you, Paul, if you don't mind, and I can answer that a little bit more concisely for you. And then Paul also commented that he's joining from Qatar. So thank you for being here from Qatar. That's one country I've not been to, but I've always wanted to. I've heard it's beautiful there. So thanks for joining all the way from there. And then Anil joining from India says, good morning. Hello, Anil. Good to see you. Thank you for being here today. So I'll follow up with you on Paul once I get a little more intel from you, a little bit more context. But in the meantime, let's dive into another trend we're seeing. And actually, as I'm getting into this next trend, I'd love to hear from you, the audience, what your thoughts are on change management. Are you seeing anything differently? Are you seeing a more intentional, deliberate, and prioritized focus on change management? Or are you seeing underinvestment in change management still? Or have you seen it, starting to shift here in recent years? I'd love to hear just your overall feedback on where you see change management headed in the world of digital transformation, and whether or not you think organizations are finally starting to get it. And perhaps you're an organization that does get it. And if you are, I'd love to hear from you what your thoughts are on change management. What's going on there? Why do we still not recognize the need to invest heavily in that area? So that's one prediction. Now let's pull up a couple more here that I've got for my list. And by the way, that particular one, if you're interested, organizational change management becomes a boardroom issue. That was number 7 on my top 10 list, just to give you some context of where it falls there in the top 10. Now, here is one that I think is high. It's higher on the list. It's number 5 on my list. I've talked about this in recent episodes of the podcast, but I'm going to dive into it again just because it's such a important topic and it always stirs up good conversation. And this is number 5 on my top 10 list of top predictions for 2026. And that is, there is going to be a vendor lock-in backlash in 2026. And I think what I mean by that is actually there's a few different threads here, a few different angles that I view this from. And that is, first of all, just to give you back up for a second, give you some context. Vendor lock-in is when it becomes very your software and difficult, right, to replace your ERP system. So anytime you implement a new ERP system or sort of enterprise technology that has, some use in your organization, it is going to be difficult to replace that no matter what. So it's always been somewhat of an issue. But what we're seeing now is contractually and business model wise, you're seeing more organizations get locked in to these long-term subscriptions that are very difficult to get out of. And what where this stems from is it's sort of a, in my opinion, a relic of the past monolithic ERP model where these big ERP software providers are trying to be everything to everyone. They're trying to get as much of a footprint as they can within your organization to sell more software, of course. And if you can, I think every ERP software vendor's dream is for you to go all in on their solution, replace all of your enterprise tech, and just put it all in one basket of that particular vendor, sign a long-term subscription contract, and it is really hard to get out of those. And it's not just the fact that contractually it's hard to get out. It's also the model of cloud is difficult. I'm going to come back to this here in a moment, the whole cloud thing. But when you're moving to a public cloud sort of environment, you're moving all your data over and you're having all of your data and applications hosted and controlled by someone else, you've really given up control of your operations, for better or for worse. In some cases, it might be a good thing because maybe that software provider is such a good fit for you. They're providing such a good solution that it's worth it, in some cases. But in most cases, what we're seeing is, there's some value and there's some benefit, but you're getting locked in and there's a downside risk that organizations have yet to see. And I think in the next year, 2 years, you're going to start to see the pushback in the sort of the whipsaw effect. I think you're going to see a backlash away from cloud, especially, when you combine the aspects of giving up control, the contractual terms that sort of lock you in longer term, the high costs. I mean, these cloud subscriptions are super high cost. And what it does is it gives the vendors the pricing levers, a sort of pricing leverage that they never had before. Before, if they raise their price on maintenance or if they raise their prices on on-premise licenses, I almost forgot the word licenses. I'm so used to saying subscriptions now. I forgot what we called it before. We called them licenses when you'd buy it on-prem. Before, if they raise the price, you just go find a different provider. And, it wasn't a huge deal. It was still a heartache. It was still chaotic and, disruptive to the business to some degree, but not like it is now. But now you get locked into these contracts and they can raise the prices however they want. And you're starting to see some backlash, like in Microsoft recently. There was a study that came out that showed that they, on average, had raised their subscription prices for D365 somewhere between 10 and 20% year over year. And you were starting to see customers that were getting pissed off about it. And what I worry about too, and this is actually my bigger fear, isn't just the fact that they have all the leverage and the pricing leverage. It's the fact that if you don't pay your bill, like, let's just get back to the basics here. For some reason, you don't pay your cloud subscription bill. Let's just say you go through some economic hard times. You have a rough quarter. Your company loses money. Maybe you're laying people off. It's just a hard time for you. Every organization goes through this at times. And let's just say you decide you're going to stretch out your accounts payable, just like most companies will do. They'll push out the payment terms, or they'll try to, float cash better or whatever, because they're in financial distress. Now, if you don't pay your software vendor, they cut off access, and which means you can't run your business. And to me, to have any outside third party with that sort of control or influence over your business is just not at all acceptable, in my opinion. So I'm fascinated by the fact that so many organizations are okay with that. Now, you could say, well, Eric, just pay your bills and everything's fine. But the reality is there is going to be a company at some point. It's going to be a big company too. I don't know when or how this will happen, but there will be a big company at some point in the near future that doesn't pay their bills. They don't, they get into financial distress. They can't pay their bills. Cloud vendor won't stretch out payment terms, whatever, cuts off access to the system, and it's going to create a major issue for that client. Now, I don't know if legal action or if there'll be lawsuits that ensue from that sort of thing or not. I'm not a lawyer, so I couldn't tell you, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were legal implications to that as well. So I think this vendor lock-in thing is a really big deal. It's something that's, it's not fun to talk about. It certainly doesn't help sell software. So if you're a software vendor, I hate to bring out the elephant in the room, but that's our job as independent tech agnostic advisors, is to bring out the elephants in the room. And this is a big one. I can't wait. I mean, I don't want to say I want disaster to ensue, but I can't wait to see how it unfolds, because I think it'll be a wake-up call for a lot of organizations to pull their head out of the clouds, so to speak, pardon the pun, pull their head out of the clouds and get back to running their business and take control of the business, and stop letting the big tech companies dictate to you how and when you move to the cloud, or how much you're going to pay for these cloud subscriptions, all that stuff. I think there's going to be a pretty big backlash there. But More importantly, what do you think? I'd love to hear your feedback. Am I overreacting to this vendor backlash thing, the vendor lock-in and the backlash that I think is going to ensue? I'd love to hear your feedback here. I want to say hello to Jose on LinkedIn, joining from Brazil. Thank you for being here. Another country I've never been to, but really want to go to. And Jose says he's an economist and a data analyst. So you are clearly much smarter than me. I feel a little intimidated, but any feedback you have or predictions you have from a economic perspective might be super interesting, Jose, if you don't mind me putting you on the spot. And as a data analyst, that's a pretty interesting combo, the economics and data analyst. I think that's a really cool, neat combo you have going there with your background. So thank you for being here. And then Paul clarified on LinkedIn, he clarified that he is a project manager, but the technology is outside his jurisdiction. I think that's a problem. I would focus on changing that, because if you're the project manager of the overall project, technology should report up to the PMO or to the project manager. Now, if you're a project manager for one work stream that's maybe running in parallel with technology, then I'd say that should all be reporting up to the same PMO that keeps an eye on the overall big picture. So that would be my recommendation or advice. I don't know if that's above your pay grade or above your scope of influence, but if there is a way for you to get everything reporting up to the same PMO, I think that's really important, because otherwise the technology piece becomes its own monster. It becomes its own work stream that's working sometimes in conflict with the other work streams, like, data migration or process improvement, certainly change management, as we talked about before. All that stuff can get out of sync pretty quickly if it's not all reporting up to the same program management. And that's something that I've been talking a lot about in recent videos and newsletter articles I've been writing recently. I've been talking a lot, just trying to really hammer home this point about the difference between program management and project management. And lately, just in the last 6 months, I've been spending a lot more time on the road, back on the road again with clients, like getting in front of clients and just being a little more hands-on with the consulting, because, as we just, not to get into too much background, but as we've grown as a company, sometimes I get removed from the day-to-day consulting that we do. So I've tried to change that pattern for myself, just, for learning purposes. So I continue to learn and stay close to our clients, but I've spent a lot more time on the road working with clients and working with some of the technology consulting companies. And it's really fascinating to me how every single consulting firm we come across, and I'm not exaggerating when I say every single one, but every single technical consulting firm we come across has it in their heads that this is their project. It's a technology project that's focused on their technology, and that is the focal point, the center of attention for the project. And I think that really needs to shift in two ways. One is technology should not be the main focus driver where you're spending 80-90% of your time and focus and discussion around technology. That's a problem. And that comes from what I would consider a sort of a narcissistic behavior or pattern that you see in the technology industry, which is, look at our great technology, look how awesome we are, this amazing tech we've created. Let's spend all of our time focusing on that technology and building out for you. And on the surface, you think, well, of course you're going to do that, because that's what you want, right? You want technology to modernize your tech stack or whatever it is. That's fine. That can be a part of it. But to focus that much time and attention on technology distracts from the things that really matter the most. And that is the change management, the process improvement, basically anything other than the software itself. Software itself has a role. It is important, but it's not nearly as important as most technology consultants think it is. And so when you're working with these technology consultants, one thing to recognize is they have their project management of one work stream within an overall program. And I think it's important to put technology in its place. And I hate to say it this bluntly, but technology needs to be put in a box, and it needs to be isolated in some ways, if that makes sense. It's more not isolating it from other work streams, but you need to contain it and say it's one work stream and it reports up to an overall program management. Your tech consultant might have a project manager for that work stream, but they're not the project manager for the overall project. And I think that's a really important distinction, because the minute you say my system integrator or my tech consulting implementation partner, the minute you say they are the project manager, you've just given them the keys to the kingdom in terms of just pushing technology and cramming technology down everyone's throat, versus putting it in the hands of a true PMO that looks at the overall big picture of the overall transformation. So that would be my little rant, my little soapbox around the difference between project management versus program management. I've put out a few videos on this thread here just recently in recent months. So if you follow me on YouTube, you may have seen some of those videos. But understanding that difference between project management, program management, and putting tech project management in its place, in its box, in a project org chart is really important. So I hope that helps, Paul. And if you've got follow-up questions, I'm happy to dive into it in more detail as well. Let's see, getting back to, here's a good follow-up comment from Patrick on LinkedIn. Thanks for being here, Patrick. I believe he's joining from Poland, just because I know of him. So thank you for joining here today, Patrick. Patrick says, haven't heard about situations with companies getting cut off from access because of payment delay, but when hard times will come for ERP suppliers, we might see some moves. But in my point of view, if this will happen, it will be a bad sign for the whole SaaS market. And I agree with you. I think it will be a bad sign, but all it's going to take is that one company that gets access cut off by that one vendor, and it's going to create, I think it'll raise concern. I hate to say this, but I kind of hope it happens soon, because I think organizations need to see that that's a possibility. It's a risk, and it will happen. So let's get it out on the table. Let's see it happen, and let's get to the reality of it, because companies need to know what they're getting into. And there are just, thousands of organizations out there, tens of thousands of organizations that are somewhat blindly going into the cloud environment, and they're unknowingly getting locked in a way that I think is going to put their business at risk. And I don't think it's a good thing, and I don't think it's good for this industry as a whole. Scott on LinkedIn says, putting tech first is the tail wagging the dog. I totally agree, but yet we continue to do it. This industry continues to put tech first, and it's hard, right? Because but what about AI? Let's talk about AI, agentic AI. Let's talk about that. And you just become so obsessed with technology that it starts becoming, a focus on, for example, agentic AI versus let's talk about how we're going to change our business, and maybe agentic AI is part of that. But it's not really about agentic AI. It's about what we're trying to do for our business, what we're trying to do for our customers, what we're trying to do for our employees, how we're trying to make their jobs easier, how we're trying to improve our operations. That's what it's about. And if agentic AI or a specific type of technology or specific vendor helps you get there, great. That's one piece of the puzzle. But the minute your tech consultant comes in and says, okay, you've got a budget of $10 million, 9.5 million of that should go to technology, that is a huge, huge problem. And that is the mindset of technology vendors as a broad generalization. Now, it's not always true, but I would say for an overwhelming majority of them, it is true. I want to say hello to Mashianoki. I'm 90% sure I butchered your name. I apologize for that. Joining from LinkedIn from South Africa. So thank you for being here today. Beautiful country. Johannesburg, Cape Town. Those are some of my favorite places that I've ever visited. So thank you for being here today. So love to hear your thoughts on this vendor lock-in. That was number 5 on my list of top 10 predictions for 2026. And again, if you're just joining, diving into some of the top 10 predictions from the enterprise tech space that I've got for 2026. And love to hear your feedback. I'm not doing this in a countdown format, although I do have a video coming out in the next few days that actually provides a countdown of this top 10. But I'm sharing with you just some of the highlights from the top 10 list and diving in a bit more detail. But again, love to hear your feedback on what you would add to the list or maybe change about the list I've got so far. So I talked about vendor lock-in, and this next one I'm going to cover is somewhat related, and I touched on it a little bit. This is actually number 6 on the list. So vendor lock-in backlash was number 5. This one is ranked just below that at number 6. This is shifting from cloud first to cloud smart, and it's somewhat related to the vendor lock-in issue that I just mentioned. But I think organizations they're starting to wise up. We're starting to see some of the early signs of this. And I would say we could thank SAP, we could thank Microsoft and other big tech vendors for maybe pushing the boundary a bit too much on the whole cloud first mentality. And I think that's what's causing a bit of a backlash, and it's causing people to start to recognize that there's some real risk here by going cloud first. And what I mean by that is, first of all, cloud's not going anywhere. Cloud is an amazing delivery model, and it's a pretty cool advancement that's happened in the last couple of decades. One of the cooler advancements that's really stuck. It does provide an ease of technology deployment that we didn't have in the past. But again, technology deployment is just one minor piece of an overall transformation. So technology is getting a bit easier in some ways to deploy, but adoption of that technology within our operations and our organization is actually getting a lot harder. So I would say the net impact that we're seeing from the cloud is actually negative in terms of it taking longer and costing more money to deploy this technology, largely because of the adoption issues that it creates. And the reason for that is because cloud systems are by definition less flexible than on-prem. For better or for worse, with your on-prem systems, you could do whatever you wanted with that technology. You could customize the hell out of it. You could integrate it to other systems. You could break it if you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted with that technology because it was yours. But now the technology is not yours. You're essentially leasing it or licensing it from a third party that controls what that functionality is going to look like long term. And sometimes you aren't even going to know that that functionality is going to change in the long term. But forget about the long term. Let's just talk about the deployment of the technology. When you move to these public cloud environments, which are essentially multi-tenant, meaning that you've got multiple companies using the same software, built the same way, it severely limits your ability to change that. Because if you think about something like, when you go to Google or Gmail, if you use Gmail, you're using a cloud email provider, and email is a pretty simple process, right? But if you did want to change something in your email look and feel, you can't really do that because it looks the same for everyone. Everyone that uses Gmail has pretty much the same look. Now you can move buttons around, you can hide buttons here and there, but mostly, for the most part, the functionality is what it is. It's not going to change. The way you use Gmail looks a lot like, if not identical to how I use it. And that's essentially how ERP systems are in the cloud. Now, there is a bit more flexibility in terms of configuration and that sort of thing, that you can do some personalization of that software. But largely speaking, it's going to be set a certain way or deployed a certain way and used a certain way. Now, again, not a bad thing so far, but where it does become a bad thing is when you look at your operations and how different your operations are than the way that cloud software works. And I'm not even here to say it's right or wrong or better or worse. I'm just saying it's different. The way your organization works right now is a lot different than any cloud system that you might think about deploying. And that journey, that gap between where you are today and what you need to get to operationally and organizationally to use that software has now increased. We've increased that gap. That chasm between current state, future state is growing. It's continuing to grow as technology advances faster and faster. So that chasm is only getting wider, which means it's getting harder for companies to deploy technologies as time goes by, which means it's costing more, it's taking more time, and it's introducing more and more risk to organizations. So that's the unsexy part of this industry that's not cool to talk about. I know it's not nearly as fun to talk about as how, the fun stuff like agentic AI and how amazing it is and how it's so easy to use, and people can just use conversational AI to interact with their ERP system. That's all cool. That's great. That's awesome. But what's happening in reality, boots on the ground, is companies are having trouble adjusting to that because it's such a big change for them. And the fact that it's in the cloud makes it even worse because there's so much limited flexibility with cloud. Now, here's where I get really triggered and frustrated by this cloud movement, is when you combine the cloud movement with the arrogance and the hubris of the big tech providers. And what I mean by that is you look at a company like SAP. I'm going to pick on them because they're the easiest one to pick on because they give me a lot of material to work with. I have a lot to work with when it comes to picking on SAP. And it's all self-inflicted, by the way. These are the things that SAP is doing that's creating these problems. But one thing that SAP does is they say, well, we have best practices. We have industry best practices. We have this RISE program that bundles all of your cloud subscriptions and the technology and the deployment all in one contract to make it so easy for you to move to the cloud. And this is the worst part, is in addition to that, all you need to do is go clean core. They've got this concept called clean core. Just get rid of your customizations, get rid of the data in many cases that you had in your legacy system. Just deploy clean core SAP. And that's their answer, is you go clean core. It's going to be an easy deployment, low risk, and we've made it, we've solved your problems. Well, you haven't solved any problems. You've actually just created more problems because now you've lost all that intellectual property, all that data. The way you used to operate is now thrown out the window, and you've got to figure out how your new business is going to work in this public cloud environment. And that's the big thing is SAP's pushing customers as many as they can get, even though they're not highly successful yet. They're not highly successful getting enough customers over to the public cloud, but long term, that's their strategy, is to get as many companies to public cloud as they can. And their answer is to say, go clean core, use our RISE contract, blah, blah, blah. So what that's doing is it's creating, it's really forcing technology down the throats of customers, and the failure rates are increasing. I mean, there's some just massive disaster SAP projects out there, and it's actually good business for us because we're getting hired to clean it up. So I shouldn't be complaining about it because it actually benefits us to see SAP floundering so much in their journey to try and change the world over to S/4HANA. But it is a problem. I think it's a huge problem in this industry. I think it's highly unethical too, but that's a whole nother conversation for another time. So the cloud first to cloud smart, I think, is something that we just need to be aware of. Cloud is not always the right answer. It's okay to be on-prem. I don't understand why on-premise has such a bad, outdated perception, when in reality, on-prem, you love it or hate it, it does provide a competitive advantage, or it can provide a competitive advantage that makes it hard to replicate. So what we're doing now as a society and as an enterprise tech space is we're basically saying we're all the same. We should all be using the same technology. And my question is, what does that do to competitive advantage? How do you sustain a competitive advantage if you're using the same technology that everyone else is? Now you can create non-technological areas of competitive advantage. Maybe you have, closer relationships with your customers, your employees, your suppliers, or whatever, things that technology can't necessarily automate. But it's still, if you look at all the companies in the world that have built massive, successful companies by using technology, they didn't do it by deploying SAP. They didn't do it by deploying a really cool ERP system. They did it by creating something super unique, a unique business model that's really hard to replicate. And not all of us need to be tech companies like Amazon, for example. Amazon, Walmart, those are two, over the last few decades, two examples of companies that use technology in a very proprietary way to create a barrier to entry, to create scalability and a sustainable competitive advantage that others can't replicate. They did it by building their own technology. Now, I'm not saying you guys should all go out and buy your own technology or create your own technology, but you have to recognize if you're going all in on cloud, you're giving up a lot of your competitive advantage, whether you like it or not. So the key is, where are the key ingredients of your secret sauce, and how could you use potentially a non-cloud, non-off-the-shelf solution that someone else can just go buy and replicate? How can you create some sort of sustainable competitive advantage within select areas of your business? Now, if you're talking about, your GL, your accounting, your accounts payable, sure. I mean, that's probably not your area of competitive advantage. By all means, go cloud, go vanilla, go clean core, whatever. But when it comes to your business, your operations, your customer relationships, the way you design and build products better than anyone else can, whatever it is, you want to look at technology smartly to say, how can we invest in that to make it more, more unique to us and more of a competitive advantage? But let me know your thoughts on cloud, because I know it seems to be a trigger for people. Not so much lately, but like 5 years ago when I'd say this, people thought I was crazy. And some of you may still think I'm crazy, and that's okay. But I'd love to hear your feedback on that. So say hello to someone on LinkedIn. I can't see the name, unfortunately. Hi from Canada and Portugal. Interesting. Must be bouncing back and forth between two pretty cool countries. We have seen some amazing implementations on ERP in oil and gas, and I tell you, they are about to be disrupted, both the integrators and the industry. I've seen some amazing implementations on ERP in oil and gas, and I tell you, they are about to be disrupted. I'd love to hear how they're going to be disruptive, or what you mean by that. Like, what kind of disruption? Good disruption, bad, or what do you mean? Another person on LinkedIn that I can't see the name says, I love your topic and thought I would join and hear overall, feel everywhere on this. ERP says in 2026 will be interesting. So thank you for that. This one is from Anil on LinkedIn. Anil says, a common challenge I hear from clients that keeping up with endless technology updates while running your actual business is exhausting. It's a good but unfortunate way to describe it. Upgrades and change management have become major pain points that distract from what really matters. What is your view on this? Absolutely. Totally agree with you. I think we're being too, we're being fed too much hype around technology, and we're not focusing on the basics. I'd much rather see a company that's maybe a little behind on their technology, but they're deploying it really well. I mean, that company is just going to be a lot more successful. I can tell you right now, they just are. They're going to spend a lot less time on the project. It's going to be a lot less chaotic. It's going to be a lot less disruption. They're probably going to get a lot more business value out of it. And even if they're not on the coolest, sexiest technology, I mean, some of the most successful deployments I've seen are actually ones that weren't on the cutting edge or bleeding edge of technology. We've got a couple clients right now that are still deploying the legacy on-prem systems. They started years ago. They're big companies, and they're still in the later stages of deploying that on-premise technology. And in many cases, they're being highly successful. I mean, we're helping them through these transformations. That are going well. They're getting business value out of it. They're starting to get a big ROI off the investments they've been making for several years. But then you've got the software vendors chirping in the background, chirping in their ear, saying, "Hey, you need to go cloud. Cloud is all cloud. We're going to stop the innovation. We're going to cut off support. Go cloud." And it's like, why? Why would you go cloud if what you have is working and you're getting business value? You're still proving out your business case from that business case you did 5 or 10 years ago. Get the business value that you wanted out of it at the time. Sweat the asset, get the business value out, and then think about cloud, maybe more selectively going forward. But it's amazing to me. You listen to some of these clients, these CIOs talk at big companies, by the way. These aren't like small companies that you could imagine get bullied around by a bigger company. These are big companies that are big customers, even for an SAP or an Oracle. And, it's amazing to me how, just a couple of years ago, those same vendors were saying, "Hey, keep buying our on-prem stuff, and you'll get all this business value out of it." Now they're saying, "Well, that's outdated now. You need the cloud version," but they still haven't proven the business case the first time. But yet they're assuring these same clients that you'll get a business case, you'll get an ROI out of the cloud, which, by the way, you're not going to. I hate to break it to the listeners here today, but you're probably not going to get a tangible ROI on a cloud migration. It just isn't going to happen, especially if you're. And let me paraphrase or caveat that with, if you're using a semi-modern on-premise ERP system, like say you're using SAP ECC, or maybe you're using Oracle EBS, to move to S/4HANA or to Oracle Fusion, it's going to be really hard to prove out a reliable business case for that. Unfortunately, it's going to be something non-tangible and non-quantifiable that would justify that migration to the cloud in most cases. So thank you for that point, that comment there, Anil. Craig on LinkedIn says, "Just came from a clean core S4 HANA project." Thank you for sharing that, Craig. I'd love to hear how it went. Did it go well? What did you think of clean core? How did you navigate some of the challenges? There's a lot. I should just pull you on camera and just start interviewing you. That'd be kind of cool. But I would love to hear from you. Any feedback you have on that clean core migration, Craig. I would love to hear your feedback there. Someone on LinkedIn, again, apologies, some of the names aren't coming through for some reason, but someone on LinkedIn says, "Hello from Belgium. Thank you for being here." And then Darian on LinkedIn says, "In your view, what's the biggest misunderstanding executives have about AI's role in transformation?" Well, I think the biggest misunderstanding is that you have to replace your core ERP system to get AI. And here's another dirty secret that the vendors don't want you to know. If you're a software vendor, your sales strategy is deploy our technology, which includes all the back office ERP stuff that you might already have, but deploy our newer version of the technology. You're going to get all the cool AI stuff that you really want. But the reality is, there are plenty of third-party AI providers out there that will give you AI capabilities in your legacy environment. In fact, there's a video actually I recorded last night that I'm putting out. I just filmed it on my phone. It's a YouTube short and a TikTok and an Instagram video that I'll publish later today. But it's about a company called Kingfisher out of Europe, and it's a retail store, SAP customer. They're using ECC, and they've got like 2,000 stores across Europe. And they are they were actually at a Gartner conference recently, and they wrote this article. I think it was in I forgot which magazine it was. I think it was CIO magazine. Published this article about how they presented at a Gartner conference recently, talking about how they said no to S/4HANA. They're sticking with ECC, but what they're doing is they're moving all their third-party support and maintenance over to Rimini Street because SAP is cutting off support. So they said, "Fine, we'll just move to a third-party support provider, and by the way, save money doing it." And secondly, we're going to deploy third-party AI tools using what we've already got in ECC because it's stable, it works, the data's clean, they're happy with ECC. And I think, as much as I pick on SAP, I do also have to recognize the positive of SAP is they've created this problem themselves largely because of their own success. And so, and I know this question isn't about SAP, but just as a side note, this is true for SAP, but also I'd say maybe even for Oracle and to a lesser degree Microsoft, is some of these ERP providers like SAP have created such good legacy products and have such good adoption of those systems over the last couple of decades that that's what's creating the problem and the hesitation to move to S4HANA. So if ECC was such a bad product or so outdated, it would be a lot easier for customers to say, oh yeah, we're ready to go to S4HANA, but most of them are pushing back on it. So there's this article about Kingfisher that came out and said, we're getting AI without S4HANA. We don't need SAP to be our AI provider. We've got AI providers that are third party. And I think that's smart because not only does it minimizes your vendor lock, it diversifies your vendor, your supplier base, and it just gives you immediate value in some cases, because I think AI can provide immediate value. The only problem is companies in many cases don't have the right systems or data in place to get it. But having the right systems and data in place doesn't mean necessarily that you need the newest, most modern systems. It just means you have to have clean data. You have to have a relatively newer type of technology. You don't need to be, cloud, all in on the cloud or in a SaaS environment to get AI capabilities. You can do that with third party providers. And that's why there are so many third party AI and integration tools out there that are doing really well. Like, you look at Snowflake or Palantir, Rapid, Databricks, some of those companies that are somewhat agnostic, they're meant to tie together multiple legacy environments or more modern cloud-based environments as well. This is from D on YouTube. D Austonian says, the cutting edge is one thing, to be the point of the sword makes you the entry to everything that's dinged, chipped, and stained. It's an interesting analogy. I had not heard that before, but that's a very good analogy, and I agree with you there. All right, so I'm going to dive into another one here. I'll try to get to two more. I'll get to one more, and then I'll save you the number one prediction here for last. I guess the one I'll talk about here is composable ERP. What I think is happening now, and we'll continue to see this trend accelerate in 2026, is that composable ERP will become the norm, and that'll become the standard for buyers. Now, whether or not software vendors go along, I guess it's to be determined which ones will play along or go down this path. But I think the more overwhelming or the more popular trend will be composable ERP. I think that's going to be the future. The monolithic single one size fits all ERP system, I think those days are done. I think we've sort of run the course on that, and we tried it. It was great while it lasted, but I think it's time for the industry to move on, because the monolithic model, especially when you combine it with the cloud first sort of mentality, going all in on the cloud, it's just, there's too many weaknesses to that model. It's too outdated. It's too inflexible. And I think it gives companies, it's creating too much pain for companies. So if anything, composable ERP is going to pick up more traction simply because it's easier. It's a path of least resistance in many cases to deploy multiple technologies that serve different needs. And I think back to the point about creating a sustainable competitive advantage, I think the way you can do that and still be cloud focused is with a composable ERP environment. So in other words, having multiple systems that do different things differently and then tying those systems together. Now, it does create a certain amount of technical complexity because obviously you've got multiple systems you've got to manage, you've got multiple data sets, potentially you've got to figure out how to integrate those systems. Those are all real risks, right? That is part of the trade-off. But the reason things are different now, in my opinion, is that the integration and the platform as a service tools that are out now are so much more powerful than they ever have been, to where now it makes it a lot more feasible to integrate different systems. And that's why companies like Boomi and MuleSoft are doing really well right now, is they are providing these integration tools that are sort of like middleware on steroids. Middleware from 20 years ago, it's nothing new, but middleware is a pain in the ass to manage. You had to be pretty deep technologically, and you had to build the APIs, and it just created a lot of technical complexity that a lot of companies didn't want to deal with. But now with Boomi, you can manage things a little bit more easily. And now you've got an off-the-shelf solution with connectors pre-built for different systems that just make integration easier to plug and play. I'm oversimplifying. It's not quite that easy, but it's not nearly as risky technologically as it used to be years ago. So I think that's why composable ERP is going to continue to pick up steam. and the fact that, again, the cloud combined with ERP provides almost like the worst of both worlds. Cloud being inflexible, ERP being, trying to be one answer for everyone, or one size fits all. Those two things combined is almost too much for organizations to try and consume. And they're just not good fits in many cases. So I think that's why you're going to see a lot more composable ERP options. And we're seeing a lot more clients that are open to that and pursuing that model. But what about you? What do you think? Composable ERP? You think that's a real thing? Do you think it's really going to happen? Am I full of it? Let me know. I'd love to hear in the comments here. Jose on LinkedIn says, what can you tell us about SAP's ERP system in relation to the topic at hand? If we're talking cloud or composable ERP, I'd say even SAP has recognized the need for composable ERP in the actions they've taken, the acquisitions they've made. So they've, in recent years or in the last decade or more, they've gone out and acquired different software providers that are essentially best of breed composable ERP options. So they bought Ariba, they bought SuccessFactors, they bought Concur, Business Objects. They bought all these different solutions and put it together, bundled it together under the SAP umbrella, but there's still different systems that need integration. The only difference now is SAP is trying to force fit those same technologies as a one size fits all solution, but it's essentially a bundled composable ERP that they're putting out as a single ERP solution. So, I guess a show of hands, if you're an SAP customer, how many of you also bought, whether you needed it or not, how many of you bought Ariba, SuccessFactors, and some of these other solutions that SAP bundles? And I imagine if we took a poll here, a majority of you would say, yes, we bought not just S4HANA, but we bought Ariba, we bought Concur, we bought SuccessFactors. It was all bundled together because that's what they do. They try to, now they're taking this composable ERP model and trying to SAP-ize it into one size fits all. We're the sole answer to all of your solutions. That's been SAP's strength and strategies for 50 years now since they started the company. So, but having said that, the model has evolved a bit to where I think even they recognize that composable ERP is a thing. Here's a question from Lewis, a really interesting one. Lewis on LinkedIn says, let's assume a general AI bubble pop. Let's assume Eric can talk first. Okay, let me try it again. Let's assume a general AI bubble pops, such as the stock market, which I think it will absolutely. I mean, this looks just like Y2K / e-commerce bubble of the early 2000s all over again. It's the same thing, and we all know how that went. So I think the same thing will happen here too. So let's assume a general AI bubble pops, which it will over the next 6 months, maybe. I don't know if it'll be 6 months or not. It's hard to say. It's pretty realistic, I think. I feel like we're getting to the end of it. But how do you envision this will affect general ERP AI advancements and user adoption in 2026? I think it might actually make it better because there's just so many AI players right now and so much noise out there around AI that it's almost like it needs to be settled down a bit. It's too much money chasing too few startups, and half these startups aren't going to survive. If we learned anything from Y2K and e-commerce bubble bursts in the early 2000s, which I hope we remember this because we're repeating history again, which is why I think history is so important, because you have to look back at history to see, wait a minute, if we do this, if we drive up these crazy stock valuations of tech companies like AI companies or e-commerce companies, what's going to happen? Well, this person, Lewis, is onto it. The bubble is going to burst. We all know that from history. So the bubble will burst. Companies will fail. The question then becomes, well, which AI providers are going to be the ones left standing? And I think once you narrow it down a bit to where there's not so much noise and not so much hype, I think it's actually going to help adoption, because right now people are super tired of hearing about it. And when I say people, I mean people outside the tech space. Those of us listening in right now might be thrilled and want to keep talking about it more, but the average end user, the average employee that's going to be affected by digital transformation isn't nearly as excited as AI as all of us are. So we just have to recognize that's where the rest of the world is. Maybe they're using ChatGPT at home and it's, helping them find cool recipes or whatever, do cool stuff on the personal front, but it doesn't mean they want AI jammed down their throat in the workplace as well. So I think the adoption will actually benefit from the bubble bursting. And I think it'll just calm things down to where we can get back to the basics of let's get past the hype and the crazy valuations and really focus on where the real value is, which is what we're going to be left with when the bubble bursts. Because right now it's irrational, right? There's all this money chasing and driving up valuations for companies that shouldn't be valued what they are. And And it's largely because, not all the solutions are great. Some of these solutions aren't good and aren't going to deliver as much business value as others. So it probably makes sense that those companies go away or fall by the wayside. Let's focus on the ones that are delivering real value. And that's going to help increase adoption as well once we get past the hype and get into just the basics of, is this delivering an ROI or not? All right, Craig. Craig says Odoo, question mark. Yes, Odoo is an option. That's actually one of our, I think we have it as one of our top 10 enterprise technologies for 2026. And that's a video we just released a couple of weeks ago on my YouTube channel, if you want to check that out too. Jose says, thanks. You're welcome. Of course, thanks for the great questions, Jose and audience here. Now I want to get back to the number one prediction I have for next year, because I promised you I'd get to it. So far I've covered just 3 or 4 of the top 10. There's a lot here we haven't covered. I'll just rattle them off for you, just so you know what some of them are. Some of the things we didn't cover before I get to number one. I didn't cover the number 10 one, which is the rise of the independent talent and consulting market. I do think, and it may sound self-serving, and it is self-serving, but I do think, even setting that aside objectively, that the independent talent, staffing, and general consulting market is going to become more and more important. And I've thought this for a long time. I mean, I've thought this since I started my first tech agnostic company in 2005. I've thought there was a need for more tech agnostic objective consulting and advisory services. But we're finally starting to see a lot of those companies pop up. And I used to be threatened by it. I used to feel threatened if someone else started a tech agnostic company like Third Stage Consulting. But what I found is that actually I like it now, because it's it's becoming a legitimate niche in the market. Like when I started Panorama in 2005, people thought I was crazy. And again, to be clear, a lot of people still think I'm crazy, but they really thought I was crazy in 2005 because the independent tech agnostic consulting space, that wasn't a thing, and it wasn't believable. Like, people didn't believe me when I said I was tech agnostic. They said, you can't be. That's just not how the industry works. So who are you really in bed with, or who are you really affiliated with? And of course, the answer was always no one. But now it's become a legitimate, I think by having more competition, more fragmentation, more independent tech advisors out there, it's still a minority of the market. An overwhelming majority of the ERP and tech space is biased, right? 90, 95% or whatever it is going to be, pro whatever vendor they represent or they focus on. But you're starting to see more and more tech agnostic companies like Third Stage Consulting that are providing those services. So I think that that independence, the tech agnostic view, is going to increase dramatically, not just because I think it's a cool business model, but because customers need it and they want it, and they don't trust software vendors. The level of trust that companies don't have for the big providers like SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, Deloitte, Accenture, all these big incumbents that have been dominating this market for decades now, there's such a high degree of distrust there that's actually what we're selling. And I tell our team this at Third Stage all the time. What we're really selling here is trust. We're selling trust and confidence that we're going to do what's right for you, not necessarily what's right for the vendors. And we don't really care about the vendors. We don't care about technology and, whether or not they make a big deal and, extend the footprint of their technology. We don't care about that. All we care about is the client getting what they need out of their investments. And as crazily simple as that sounds, or it sounds like such a no-brainer, it's actually very uncommon still in the market, but it's becoming more and more common. So I think that tech agnostic, that independence, is going to become more and more of a trend here. So that's one that we didn't get to. One important one that I actually had hoped to get to today was number 8 on the list, and that is legal and regulatory tech risks rise. And I should just talk about it for a second, but keep an eye on lawsuits in the enterprise tech space, because they are increasing, and not just lawsuits like customers that fail in their implementations. There are more and more lawsuits happening there. But the real interesting ones are the big regulatory bodies throughout the world, like the EU in particular. Watch the EU and what they're doing, because they're going after SAP now on the third-party support market. They're investigating them for potential antitrust behavior. And this is something that I think has been a long time coming, and I'm glad to see it. Even if EU's not successful, even if they settle the case or they drop the charges, which they may, I think it's really good, because it's bringing to the attention of enterprise buyers that there is monopolistic an unethical behavior happening in this space, and you just need to be aware of it. Like, know what you're dealing with and know what the landscape is, because the EU is digging deep into this whole third party maintenance and support thing. So they're investigating whether or not SAP um, is acting in antitrust, anti-competitive kind of ways by limiting customers' ability to use third-party support options. So imagine you buy a car and the dealer forces you to go to their dealership to get the oil change. You can't go to Grease Monkey or to Jiffy Lube or to, whatever chain of oil change providers you have out there. You can't go. It's illegal. They won't allow it. That would be illegal. That's antitrust behavior. And if that happened in the B2C space, the business to consumer space, that would have been outlawed a long time ago. But because we're in the B2B space, regulators don't seem to have the same level of empathy for big businesses getting screwed by one another. They don't have the same empathy for that as they do consumers. But if we saw just a glimpse of this behavior in the B2C space, this would have been regulated a long time ago. So good news, bad news, I suppose. The good news is this industry probably does need to be regulated because it's so out of control. The bad news is that we've invited this all ourselves by acting the way we do. We've invited regulatory scrutiny, and it's not just the EU. There's a lawsuit in the US around involving Epic Software, which is an electronic health record provider. They're being sued for, again, limiting and stifling third-party integration to their technology. And so just keep an eye on some of these lawsuits, because I think the trend is picking up pretty rapidly, the regulatory trend in the space. And I think it's actually a bad thing. I think it's a good thing in the short term, but it's a bad thing long term. We didn't need to have a bunch of regulations, but we're going to end up with it because of the way the industry acts. So keep an eye for legal and regulatory tech risks arising. That was number 8 on my list. And then without further ado, let me just jump to number 1, because I hyped it up and said I would share it with you. But the number 1 thing on my list is that ERP loses its monopoly. So not a literal monopoly. That's probably a bit hyperbole there, admittedly. ERP does not have a monopoly, but on the enterprise tech space. But I think it's sort of the utopia of the enterprise tech space that CIOs and tech buyers have aspired to for decades now, which is, that single ERP system that gives us everything we need within our tech stack, everything we need within our operations. That's that sort of utopia that we all strive for. And that's been the focal point of the enterprise tech space for decades now. It's been ERP this, ERP that. It was all about ERP. And yeah, there was always these little subcategories or niches that were on the outer skirts of the enterprise tech space. But I think what we're going to see here in 2026 is an acceleration of ERP actually becoming less important to the enterprise tech space, which may sound weird coming from someone who built their entire career in the ERP space, which is where I started and how I built, 2 companies to consult to. But I think ERP is becoming less and less important. And because we're tech agnostic, I can say that and not feel too bad about it, because I think that's what's happening is the big SAPs and Oracles, maybe not as a company, but the products, SAP S/4HANA, Oracle Fusion, Microsoft D365. I think those systems become a lot less important in the future, because ERP is no longer the focal point, the center of gravity for enterprise technology. You've got too many other options now that are competing for that same center of gravity, that I think it's going to continue to water down the ERP stranglehold on the enterprise tech space. And that's why companies like Boomi, Palantir, Databricks, Snowflake, that's why some of these companies that are not ERP providers, but they provide some sort of end-to-end solution or an ability to have an end-to-end technology solution, even if it's from multiple vendors. That's why those companies are doing so well. And it goes back to some of the other trends I talked about too: composable ERP, third-party AI types of solutions, being cloud smart, not necessarily cloud first. You add up all these different trends that we've talked about, and it leads to one conclusion, in my opinion, which is ERP is going to become less important as a category in 2026 and beyond. And what's going to replace it? Well, I think it's going to get replaced by AI. Is certainly going to replace a big chunk of it. The integration and platform as a service tools like Boomi, for example, is another one. I think the ERP vendors that are best positioned to survive this transition are the ones that have built platforms, open platforms that allow and embrace the composable ERP model. So you look at like Salesforce, for example, they've got their development and integration tool that anyone can build an app within the Salesforce platform that integrates and plays nicely with Salesforce and other third-party developed tools on the Salesforce platform. So that composable ERP platform model, I think, is really picking up steam, and the companies that are on the right side of that, I think, are the ones that are going to succeed. So I think Salesforce is really well equipped to survive the transition. Even NetSuite, which sounds strange because they're like the epitome of cloud, SaaS cloud providers, because they were built in the cloud, SaaS multi-tenant back in '98. So their whole model has been built on the cloud. But despite that, they have opened up their platform to third-party developers and third-party applications, which are giving NetSuite customers more options now. So you don't have to deploy just NetSuite as it stands. You can get NetSuite along with other third-party apps that bolt onto NetSuite in the NetSuite platform. So I think NetSuite is well positioned. I think Microsoft is actually well positioned too, simply because they have so many other tools besides ERP. So they've got, they've always had SharePoint and Power BI, Power Apps. Obviously the connection to Copilot and OpenAI, is helpful as well. So I think Microsoft is well positioned. I think even like QAD is a manufacturing ERP system that has completely changed their approach, moving from the monolithic ERP to more of a composable ERP platform. There's an AI platform that you can use to integrate multiple tools that aren't even from that same vendor. So QAD is another, kind of older school technology provider that is now shifting completely into this composable model. And so I think those sorts of ERP systems are going to be the ones that do well and thrive in this environment. So keep an eye on that as well. But what do you guys think? What do you think about ERP losing its monopoly? Do you think it's still going to continue to reign as the supreme enterprise tech and the utopia we all strive for, or have those days passed and we're looking for something different now? I'd love to hear what you think in the chat here. So those are some of the predictions we have for 2026. And keep an eye out on my YouTube channel for the video where I summarize all 10 of them in a countdown sort of format. That'll be out shortly on my YouTube channel. And also, if you haven't yet, if you want to keep up with other sorts of trends, I did just publish a new book a few weeks ago called Welcome to the Jungle. That book is available on Amazon. You can get it hard copy, paperback, hardcover, or electronically anywhere in the world. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, you can get the book delivered to you very quickly. Scan the QR code right here. Or if you go to Amazon, just search my name, Eric Kimberling, Welcome to the Jungle. That's the name of the book, and appreciate any feedback you have on that book. So be sure to check that out. You can scan the QR code to learn more about it, read about what the book's about. But in that book, I cover a lot of trends and where I think the market is headed. And it's also meant to provide some lessons from failures too. So the book weaves in a lot of case studies of failed implementations and what they did wrong and what the successful organizations are doing differently to avoid those same sorts of challenges or failures. So thank you for joining here today. Really appreciate everyone's time. Appreciate all the great feedback and input and questions. This podcast will get edited, or this conversation will get edited. We'll add some additional content to it. It'll get released as a formal Transformation Ground Control podcast that'll be released in a couple weeks. You can listen to or watch that podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com, and you can see it or watch it on whatever platform you want. You can also subscribe to it. We've got 250 or so episodes already over the last few years, so be sure to check that out. You can go to the transformationgroundcontrol.com to see all the past episodes and listen to whatever ones look of most interest to you. So hope you all have a great day. Thanks again for being here, and we will see you all soon. And we'll be back actually, we won't be back next Tuesday because I'll be on holiday, but 2 weeks from today, we'll be back with another live discussion. So be sure to join us again, and hope you have a great week in the meantime. Take care.